Welcome to this Future of London Council-led Housing Forum webinar. It's great to have you here today. As you'll appreciate, we're only as good as our IT and our internet in particular. So hopefully you and ourselves will not have any interruptions. But if we do, please do bear with us. We do have backup, and we'll get back up online as quickly as we can. So, Council-led Housing Forum was set up to support the London boroughs delivering new council housing, and that might be delivered directly. Some of you may be in teams within boroughs, some of you might be based in Almos or in council companies. And what we want to do is to try and help to spread good practice and to make the process as good as it can be. So we're here to share that knowledge across the sector. Today's session is on a topic, I think, where that couldn't be more important, which is managing the design process. Okay, should introduce myself. My name is Visika Sri Chandrasekara and I'm the Council-led Housing Forum Manager. And Future of London, who hosts the Council-led Housing Forum, is an organisation you may not be familiar with, or you may do. I hope you are. But if you're not, we're a network for the built environment. We were set up by the London boroughs, and we provide knowledge, leadership, and networking opportunities. And none of what we do is possible without the generous support of our sponsors. So Council-led Housing Forum is sponsored by the GLA, Potter Raper, Red Loft, and BPTW Architects. And you'll be meeting our sponsors during the session. They're supporting us as well with expertise. Right, we're going to go straight into our first presentation. This is managing the design process, and we have partners Neil Campbell from BPTW and director Katie Parsons from BPTW, and the two of them will be doing a joint presentation. Do apologise, my screen is jumping.
Thanks,
just
Visika.
a little bit there. Apologies, Neil. Katie, I'm just looking for Katie at the moment.
Hello.
Oh, I can see you now. So actually, this is something that everybody might want to do. You might want to go into view speaker because it does make it a lot easier for your screen. Right, I'm going to hand over to Neil.
Thanks, Visika. Hello, I'm Neil Campbell. I'm a partner architect at BPTW, and I'm here to talk about managing the design process with my colleague Katie Parsons.
Hello, nice to see everyone here today.
So could we move on to the next slide, please? So just by way of an introduction, we considered when we were putting this presentation together that the best way to do this was look at the design process from an architect's perspective. Obviously, Katie and I are both architects. We work for the same practice, BPTW. But what we wanted to do was then focus on the client and design team interaction and draw out the kind of the discussion and thought process through that. What we're going to do is consider the design stages up to the appointment of a main contractor. And we also thought, given the audience and focus on obviously local authorities here, we're assuming in relation to the way that a main contractor might be appointed, that the most likely procurement method is going to be a single stage design and build process. And that's quite important in this, and we'll come on to why later, because it informs really how you go through the various design stages and think about the next ones up to obviously ultimately getting on site and delivering your building. We are going to touch on the process following tender, and we're going to do this by talking about the design process following the Royal Institute of British Architects, RIBA, which hopefully everyone's heard of, Plan of Works 2020. which has been, I mean, this came in obviously this year. There's been a plan of works for years and years that have been refined and aligned to the kind of working methods and processes that we're used to, which has obviously changed over the years. And just move on to the next slide, please. And this gives this little snapshot of that. The other thing we're going to do is reference a project that we all the way through this, and just look at the various stages of information and level of design through that. And we're going to use a project that we did for a local authority in Barnet called Prospect Ring, and we'll touch on that as well. And I think it's a useful way to illustrate the design process just through that sort of singular process that we took there. The RIBA Plan of Works 2020 is a really helpful resource, and I think we're going to send around links to some of the information that we're going through here today. There's a lot of information on this slide. I'm not expecting everyone to read it, but this is the Plan of Works 2020. And but the thing to bear in mind here is that the Plan of Works is used for all project types and all procurement types, which is why it looks a bit more complicated than it probably is. However, the iterative design process is the same no matter what the scale or procurement method is. So starting from stage 0 through to stage 7. So we're going to largely talk around 0, 1, 2, 3, and a bit of 4. That gets, because that's largely where the design process is, and then 5 is manufacturing construction, which is basically on site, handing over, and in use. But it's definitely worth following this webinar, just familiarizing yourself with this, because I think it's a really, really useful resource. Next slide, please. Just stepping back a little bit, I'm thinking about the RIBA Plan of Works and your own internal processes. One of the issues that we often see is that internal sign-off processes and your processes as a client don't necessarily relate or align to the design stages. And this can cause problems, really, because what it means is that it's difficult to reach agreed milestones. So we might get somewhere before you do, or you might get somewhere before we do, and that causes a problem. So one of the things to bear in mind from the off is thinking about how we as a design team can align our design process with yours, so that we can touch base at key points, key milestones through the process. And we're going to talk about that in a bit more detail. But it's also worth noting that there are quality assurance processes that sit alongside the sequential work stages of the RIBA stages. And at BPTW, we undertake these for every single project, and other architects will do the same. And some of these you'll see in a really obvious way, but others more behind the scenes. But again, they're useful resources, and useful to know that these things are happening. So, for example, we obviously have a system of putting projects onto our system, but we create a project fact sheet. That's a really useful kind of simple snapshot of what the project's about. We create a delivery guide, so that's about planning the project for us internally. We obviously undertake a risk management plan and design risk hazard register. Those are things that are important and we have to do through under the CDM regulations. And we have various templates that we use, for example, end of stage reports, and that again we find really useful, because we'll go through some of those in a bit more detail. And finally, at the end of our work, we have a client feedback stage because we want to know how we've worked and how our processes have worked, because we recognise that those need to change sometimes, and we're quite happy to hear that. So next slide, please. So now we're looking at RIBA stage 0. So this is now the detail of the larger spreadsheet that we showed you at the beginning. I mean, stage 0, the fact that it's 0 is kind of strange in itself, because you'd expect to start at stage 1. And I think stage 0 is a bit more of a latter addition to the RIBA Plan of Works. But in a way, it's quite a good way of considering this stage, because it's about getting everything in place before you really make a meaningful start, and also before you get lots and lots of people involved, like your expansive design team. Next slide, please. Now, this stage, and I think it's one that there's a lot of ambiguity about, so we're going to go through this in a little bit more detail. It's often undertaken in-house, so we're often not involved, but we can be. So sometimes we see projects from stage 1, and sometimes we're involved from stage 0. even more complicated, sometimes we're just involved at stage 0 and then another architect picks it up at stage 1, and that's a little bit ambiguous as well, but again we'll come on to a little bit more detail there. So it's basically about pulling all the kind of key ingredients of the project together. So as I said, we're sometimes involved and we're appointed to assist in the site evaluation. An employer's agent might be appointed on this stage to assist on behalf. But most importantly, it's about defining the client requirements. So why are you developing the site and what are your priorities and key drivers? Now, things that we often see, and sometimes we're presented with all of them as key drivers, and we often ask what the priorities are, and the answer is all of them. And in a way that is important, I think, to give some sense of importance to some of them so that we understand how decision making will be taken. So, for example, the kind of things that we often see as priorities are program. Not surprisingly, this can be linked to funding, as all of you will know, often unrealistic from the outset. And one of the things that we make a plea about is understanding what a realistic program could be. There's no point in setting a program up from the beginning that's destined to fail. We want to sign up to a program that we know that we can meet well, and it's not just us, there's lots of other people involved, and you as a client team too. Setting the budget, testing it and it being realistic. Again, we need to know as architects and design team what the budget is so that we can design accordingly, and we will keep that in mind while we are designing. Sustainability targets, obviously something that's really, really important through the design process, and particularly at local authorities. Need to understand what those are, what your ambitions are, so that again, that informs the design process right from the off. We obviously know that there's housing targets, specific needs in boroughs, and those are often particular key drivers. BIM is another one that we often see, building information modelling. This is a particularly interesting one in a way because we see this in a lot of tenders, but I think there's a lot of a misunderstanding often of what this means and what it's for, and when you need to engage in the BIM process, which is right at the beginning. So it's something that I think makes sure that there's an understanding of what BIM actually means before perhaps that arrives in a tender as it goes out, so that there's no misunderstanding of what you're asking for. And housing quality is an obvious one. I mean, that we would aim for the highest level of housing quality as well, but there might be something very specific to you as a client around that subject. Next slide, please. So what we do at this stage is we, if we're involved, we undertake a site appraisal, and that might include, well, it would very likely include site analysis, a policy context in relation to planning policy and legal status, some of those kind of key things that you just need to understand from the beginning. We would very likely do a desktop capacity study based on initial options, and what we've done in the past with other local authorities is undertake a traffic light approach. Really simple kind of, we've done this to help really categorize sites, particularly on small site development. It was very helpful. So setting a number of parameters, you quickly review and basically categorize in 3 under red for difficult to develop or undevelopable, amber for potential but with constraints and probably needs further analysis, and you might need to think about program in this case because there are other things about the site that need to be considered, and then green sites that have good development potential and can move forward with confidence. And it's a good kind of little benchmarking process, because I mean, one of the things we want to make sure here is that we don't end up pursuing a non-starter, and I'm sure we've all had some of those, and you don't want to find out about a non-starter site too far in the process, because you'll have wasted a lot of time and probably money and fees, etc. So after that desktop capacity study, that's basically getting to the point of, are there any issues in relation to developing the site? And so we're moving through this process. And at this point, we need to consider the approach to project procurement. And as I mentioned earlier, we're considering, for the purpose of this discussion, that this is a single stage DMB, but it might not be. There are other things. There are many other procurement methodologies that are out there. And, I think it's an ever moving landscape of procurement, and probably something that we'll touch on in the workshops later. Also, we need to consider the approach to appointing the design team. Now, one of the helpful things that the RIBA Planner Works does is help understand what the stages are. And so one of the questions you need to ask yourselves and as a team is, what stages are you appointing for? Is it up to planning? Is it all work stages? Are you going to tender? Those kind of things are very important at the beginning, so that when you go to tender for your design team, it's very clear what the scope is. And that also relates to how extensive your team needs to be. So how complicated is the project? Are there any particular issues around the site that might require specialist advice, for example? But as a first port of call, an EA and an architect can help with that and help you understand what a suitable design team would look like at the various stages through the process. The other really, really important thing is, are you clear on the brief and scope for the design team? I think something we see a lot from the other side, if you like, as tenders land with us, is that we see really, really extensive scopes, perhaps, that probably are designed for large or complicated projects. They may have come as part of a framework procurement method, but they're being used for small or quite simple projects. And really, you don't need all of that scope. And then what you want to make sure is you're asking for what you need and paying for what you need ultimately. And that's another very important aspect to this sort of planning stage. So part of stage 0 generally is that you would undertake a tender process for the appointment of the design team. We're very aware of the kind of procurement hurdles that you need to go through, because we see them from the other side, and we know that it's necessary to go through a stage approach to procurement. But the clearer you as a client team are about the procurement, the better the tender process will be. We've undertaken, and if you've undertaken a really good stage 0 process, you'll undertake a good tender. That the two things are aligned. So a good tender return is about us understanding what you want and pricing and giving you the information that you need back, so that it's very clear, and that when you get your tender returns, you're able to compare apples with apples. If we've also seen often, unfortunately, that we get quite an open set of documents, and that leaves room for a lot of interpretation. So we don't know how to price it, we don't know how to plan our work, and we ask lots of questions, which ultimately extends the tender process. So the more full that pack is, the better. So just next slide, please. So in terms of the stage 0 summary, the key to this stage is to define the project requirements. The more accurate planning that happens in this stage, the easier the following stages. So time spent in this stage definitely saves time later. There's no doubt about that. Next slide, please. So moving on to stage 1, considering that the appointment of the design team has been made. So this is a snapshot from the RIBA Planning Works again of the kind of things that are happening here. It's called preparation and briefing. So it's about pulling together the project brief and making sure that it works, and that requires some testing on the site, which is what we do in this stage. And there are a number of core tasks listed there and information exchanges. And each of these stages are set out like this. So again, just making reference to it, it's a really useful kind of just touch point, just to see if this aligns to what you're actually doing through the process. Next slide on please. So what we're doing is in this stage is assembling information, and it's a briefing stage, defining responsibilities. That's very important. Checking in on the project budget again. As mentioned, we need to understand what the budget is, so that we design the right thing. We're establishing the project program in a little bit more detail. We're undertaking site surveys or on your behalf, or organising with you surveys that need to be undertaken. We do a site visit, and we assess and all of this site information to pull together the best picture we can of the site at this next level of information. So next slide, please. And what we then go on to do is look at how the site might be developed. So look at constraints and opportunities, look at feasibility options, and it is definitely an option stage, because it's about testing to the brief. And it's an iterative process of testing the brief being reconsidered, and look again at the site, so that what we want to do at the end of this is have a much clearer picture of ensuring that your objectives of the brief can be met, and the site is appropriate to do that. So here we've got a few. This is the work we undertook in Barnet at Prospect Ring. There's and some options appraisal work and sort of high level kind of strategy thinking about the wider context. At this stage, it's likely to have an initial pre-application meeting. We'd also consider the consultation strategies, so thinking about when we're going to engage with the public, with key stakeholders. We return to the risk management process. So we all through the work stages, we're trying to de-risk the project by returning to the program, returning to the viability and checking on the budget and looking at the project risk process too. What we're doing, as I mentioned, we're trying to finalise the project brief that is appropriate to do at this stage, and we end this stage with a stage report and conclusion. And this is really, really important because it's one of the kind of milestones really that we think that everyone benefits from. So clear end of stage reporting avoids going back and redoing work. So everyone is clear in the team, client, design team, that we've reached the end of the stage, that we're confident that we've done that. We've selected a option that we think meets the brief relative to this stage, and that we as a team are able to move on to the next stage and not look back. And this is how we avoid doing abortive work. These stages are designed to ensure that they're clearly defined and you move confidently from one to the next, so that when you're in the next stage, stage 2, you don't come back into stage 1 because it's well understood. Now, there might be reasons why that has to happen, but generally speaking, that is, you design a process for that not to happen. So I'll just hand over to Katie, if I may, to carry on with stage 2.
Yeah, so next slide. Thanks, Neil. I think it's really important what Neil's already outlined there. And one of the most important aspects of this changeover to stage 2 is absolutely the end of stage report for stage 1. And the key to that is the brief. At this point, at stage 2 at the outset is actually when you engage with a much wider design team. So from this point going forward, any changes that are made, any decisions involve a much wider and broader team, which is fantastic for the project. But as Neil's outlined to us already, it's important to establish, that very clear early brief at stage 1. So at the start of stage 2, it's important to review the stage 1 end of stage report and design brief. Ideally then, as you work through stage 2, which is regarded as the concept design, it's an opportunity to coordinate with a wider design team, a full design team, as much as possible, depending on the project. And at the end of this stage, really what we want to achieve is a design that's approved by the client, and whatever that means for you internally, which we would understand from the brief, but is approved by the client and is aligned with that project brief. So on to the next slide. Basically, through this process, coordinated design, it involves regular design team meetings, which sometimes involves you as the client and sometimes doesn't, and workshops, sort of more involved meetings between perhaps 2 sets of design team or more, to really sort of work through this process, work through the design and keep developing a coordinated design. The brief is really important at this stage as well. It's not fixed yet. It's still work in progress. We're still thinking of the design. We're still trying to make it better. We're still taking information, between each party and really making it better. And importantly, at this stage, we're not only designing as a wider team, but actually we're engaging externally with third parties. On to the next slide, please. So what we tend to do here as a design team is consider those third-party meetings. There are more pre-application meetings to be had, perhaps specific to highways and landscape, as well as continuing the design process. We might even engage in things like design review panels, depending on the size of the project. And certainly through this process, we're taking that information and feeding it into the project and feeding it into the brief, really solidifying what are the key aspects, always reflecting in order to move forward. Cost is important in every stage, has been touched on. And at this stage, really, I think there's more of an idea of what the design is evolving into. And there's some images here as well of Prospect Ring. We're really considering, we've got a bit more of a handle on those strategies coming forward from the wider design team. And I think it's important to considered the costs throughout the process, through perhaps intermediate review, as well as then that final stage report and conclusion. So if we move to the next slide, during this time, public consultation, pre-app, it all feeds into the final design. Any changes that are made come into place. And really, by the end of this stage, we should have a much clearer idea and a fix really on unit mix and location, the general arrangement plans, the height and massing, a strategy for the elevations, access, landscape, energy, and the construction method. All of these things should have come together at the end of stage 2, so that we have a clear brief to move the project forward. That concept design is fixed and in place, ready for the team to continue. If we go on to the next stage, onto the next page, sorry. We move into stage 3 on the next slide. And at this point, we review the stage 2 report and brief. The design team are still working, hopefully the same team are still working together to test and analyze the strategic strategies and to further refine the concept. The idea at the end of stage 3 would be to have a spatially coordinated design, and ideally we would go through to a planning application submission. But within stage 3, we follow that submission through to determination as defined in the RIBA work stage. On to the next slide, please. During this stage, the project strategies need to be concluded. They should be fully coordinated. The outline specification should run alongside the design, and all of the reports for the planning application submission should be completed. So really all of the team have been working together through stage 2. We've reviewed the brief, we've agreed that the brief is great, and we keep working through it. At this point, if any major changes are made, we have to go back to the stage 2 brief, reflect on it, and then move forward again. And that can be done quite well with the design team at this stage, as we've all been working together quite well. If we move on to the next slide, please. During stage 3, we like to be able to conclude the story and certainly make sure that everything we've worked on throughout the process actually has a true meaning, it can be followed through and is understood well by others. Visualizations really help with this part of the process. 3D visualizations, a fantastic way of exploring and explaining the project and the strategies. As we go through to submitting the planning application, that coordinated set of drawings, which should have been established early on, all come together and create a wider pack. But it's important when the application is submitted that we actually put in place a process for tracking the application, so that when it goes into that validation process, if the planning team and local authority have questions and comments or need further understanding of any element of the work, they have someone to come back to. And this doesn't have to fall on the client. This can come back to us as your architect or other design team members or as a group. The end of stage report of the stage 3 element is significant. It brings together all of the aspects of the design that we've all put in, all of the hard work and effort. It has a clear understanding of what the brief of the project is, and ensures that going forward, if the design team changes after this point, there is a clear understanding of those principles, the key principles of the project from the client perspective, to ensure that things such as cost, design elements that are important are actually taken forward and understood. This takes us on to the next slide, stage 4. Stage 4, as shown at the beginning on the much bigger RIBA plan of works that you saw, it covers quite a few bases of pre-construction. But more clearly on this RIBA plan of works is that the tender process is covered in stage 4. During this stage, this may or may not be included in the appointments for the project with yourself, but it could be. It's a way of safeguarding design detail going forward, pre-tender, and certainly appointments could be extended to incorporate part of stage 4. We're calling this stage 4A. If we go to the next slide, please. In past lives, you might have seen things and been involved with stage D+ or 3A, basically information that pulls together a pack for tender. During this time, like I said, not every project necessarily is taken into this detail. Sometimes the end of stage 3 report is enough. That's the end of a project for many of us in the design team. And it also might be a pause for you as a client to pick the project up later on. But stage 4A, a tender pack, might help you set in stone some key items to safeguard the design, to refine the brief, and really to help secure more accurate costing of the scheme going forward and into a tender process. On to the next slide, please. During this process, if we were appointed to come forward, it wouldn't just involve architects, it would be a wider design team to ensure that continued coordination is in place. Key details would be developed to safeguard the design expectations. Strategies would be further developed, and particularly employers' requirements should be designed at this stage and refined and fed into by the rest of the design team. It's a perfect opportunity to share that information and make sure again that you have the right level of information for this specific project and to be project specific. I think it's a real opportunity, and we've certainly found on projects that the design team that were involved during stage 2 and 3 could actually set time aside and costs aside to work on this element of a process, particularly as there might be specific site restraints, specific project need and program to take into consideration. On to the next slide. During the stage 4 process or 4A process, it's certainly time to consider how you see the design team that you've been working with going forward. As I mentioned earlier, maybe it's the end of our remit with the project. As you engage with a contractor on a design and build route, it does open the path for other design team members to come in place of us. But you may have liked working with the design team, and you may like to suggest that we and other designers continue on the path for this project. So it's an opportunity to novate, to name us in the contract, and to recommend us to those contractors that you go to. This would help ensure some of the design history is there. We're all privy to that information and are able to share that with the contractor going forward. Of course, then they become our employer going forward and not yourself. There is also another role to consider, the role of a design guardian. This helps us maintain that design aspirations and to continue working with you to make sure that those items are transferable and expressed to the contractors going forward. Basically, it's an opportunity to ensure you get the best quality. And as Neil mentioned previously, through each of the stages, it's important to reflect on what it is that you actually want from the project and what works for you so that you can build that into the process. If we move to the next slide. So I'll bring Neil back in on this part as well.
Sure.
We thought it was good to look at things to look out for, Neil, wasn't it? So we've listed out a few key items of our thoughts on this part.
And certainly not an exhaustive list by any means, but just going from the top, I mean, back in stage 0 here, take time to be clear on your priorities and look ahead to consider what might be coming down the line. So I think we've talked about stage 0 and the importance of that and setting the project up correctly, and that is we see that as really the sort of fundamentals to pulling everything together from the off. Appointing the design team for the right work stages, something else that doesn't happen all the time, and we've talked a little bit about that, and thinking about that obviously sits directly hand in hand with the procurement. Now, again, as noted, we know that how you procure in a local authority is quite defined, and there's a process to be undertaken. But just to amplify the point, because of the way that we're appointed, we have been appointed, for example, on stage 0 to aid you as a client, and then not appointed on stage 1 to 3 because that involves another procurement process. And it could well be that you have an architect at stage 0, you have to tender for the planning stage, which is 1 to 3, and then retender again for 4A. Now, that could lead you to working with 3 different design teams. Now, we understand that, you know, there's lots of complexities around procurement, but in our view, this can't be the best way of ensuring the best quality. And one of the things we haven't mentioned here, but, you know, it's inherent to this, is the kind of golden thread of responsibility, which is very, very important. This is how you ensure that you get the building that you want, and it's designed in the way that you want, and that there's a responsibility that runs through the whole of the design process. So one of the complexities around all of this, and I'm sure we'll touch on it later in workshops, is procurement, and finding a way of appointing the team for the right stages that suit the project. And I think Katie and I both touched on this, keeping the brief updated and right at the centre of the project. So returning to the brief at every stage, ensuring is checking back that the design meets the brief, and refining the brief all the time. And it is a live document, but it gets more and more defined as through the process.
And I think that's important with the stage reports as well, isn't it, Neil? And the brief is added at the end of each stage report. And it's interesting that although the work becomes greater, the volume of work that you have surrounding these reports is much greater from each design aspect, but the actual report becomes smaller because it's more refined and more condensed and much more clear as you go along, as it should be.
Yeah. And I mean, that definition of gateway sign-off is very important, so that we know that there are many interdepartmental involvement across your internal client kind of organization, but the gateway sign-off can really help that, so that there are key stages of interaction with all those different people, all these different departments that these stage reports can go to, and so that there's absolute confidence across the organization from our perspective and yours that we finish one stage and move into the next, and it avoids abortive work. And no one wants abortive work. We don't want it, and you know, that puts pressure on programs, etc., etc. And that really leads into, you know, the transparency of a sign-off process and who needs to be involved, and, you know, going back to considering the structure of your organization to make sure that the people are lined up to make those decisions as well, or the different departments that we know that we need to interact with, so that they're part of the process.
That's been absolutely excellent. Very thorough drive through the process, incredibly helpful, and to have your reflections. And I think from the architect's perspective, from a design perspective, your comments on how things work, very useful to us. So thank you very much. And it's at this point in the morning that we're going to say goodbye to the YouTube audience. So our YouTube audience, thank you for watching. And if you're interested in Future of London and Council-led Housing Forum, do check out some of the other videos of our previous events, and also have a look at the Future of London website. We have our events are always listed there, and they're free. So goodbye, and thank you again for joining us.